I took down Apple itself in court. A couple of clarifications before I start. I worked for 2 years at an Apple retail store and left on good terms to pursue a full-time job in my field after graduating college. I quit a few months before the events described here. While the crux of the conflict might make me seem petty, it was the final straw after all the arrogance Apple displayed throughout the process. About a year and a half ago, I had issues with both my MacBook and iPhone, so I decided to book an appointment at the Genius Bar, a section in Apple stores, for free consultations and technical support. It used to be simple. Go to the support website and book a convenient time. But over time, Apple set up a bunch of obstacles to reduce the load on the Genius Bar. I assume Angela Ahrens, then head of Apple's retail, decided it was cheaper than hiring more staff, and that most customers were so obsessed with Apple products they'd keep buying despite worsening service. After finally navigating all these barriers to book an appointment, they asked for my Apple ID and password, informing me that it had been 3 months, so I need to change my password. Probably the 10th time since creating the Apple ID. I could still use the App Store, iCloud, and other services, but to get service, I had to change my password. After jumping through hoops just for a basic service visit, I gave up, decided this was an unnecessary and excessive requirement, and filed a complaint through the Better Business Bureau, BBB, which handles disputes between businesses and customers. Apple's first response via the BBB was a boilerplate letter saying I just needed to change my password for my own security, and there were no exceptions. I responded, pointing out that this was poor customer service and contradicted Apple's credo, the service principles they train all employees on. Their next response: Apple considers this matter closed. I hate that response. In corporate speak, it means, we don't care about you anymore, go away. Soon after, the BBB closed the case. I did some research and found that under my Apple Care Plus subscription, a paid extended warranty and support program for both devices, there was no universal clause allowing Apple to deny service. There were exceptions, but arbitrary account security requirements weren't among them. I filed a small claims lawsuit seeking compensation for the cost of the laptop and phone. Here's where things got interesting. I showed up to court on the assigned day, was called to the stand, and saw the manager from the store where I used to work representing Apple. The hearing was in the same county, but that store was much farther away than the Apple store, just a couple of kilometers from the courthouse. I never found out for sure, but I think Apple didn't bother reading the lawsuit details, saw my name, and assumed it was a labor dispute since I was a former employee. The judge asked me to explain why I filed the lawsuit. In a minute, I clearly stated Apple imposed an unnecessary requirement, not outlined in the contract, preventing me from getting service, so I was seeking compensation for the device's cost. The judge then turned to the store manager, who showed up in a t-shirt and jeans while I was dressed formally out of respect for the court. Before hearing Apple's side, the judge asked if he was a lawyer. The manager said no. The judge explained that, per state law, only an executive director, registered representative, or hired attorney could represent a company in court, and they'd need to hire a lawyer and move the case to a higher court. The manager said he understood but offered to book me into the Genius Bar right then to fix my devices. The judge thought this was reasonable. We agreed on a time for my visit to that store, and the case was postponed for 2 weeks to see if this would work. I went to the appointment, the technician fixed all the issues, and a senior Apple specialist sent me an email saying they disabled the mandatory password reset for my Apple ID, so I'd never have to change it again. Great. But I had spent $60 on filing the lawsuit to get this far. I returned for the follow-up hearing and saw the same manager again. That day, the court was swamped, and a different judge was handling cases as quickly as possible. No nonsense. We were called, and I explained that since the first hearing, all technical issues had been resolved, so I no longer sought compensation for the devices. However, I argued that I shouldn't have had to go to court to get what I was entitled to as an Apple Care Plus customer, and requested reimbursement of my $60 court fees. The judge turned to the manager, asked again if he was a lawyer, and the manager said no. The second judge gave the same lecture. The manager argued that Apple shouldn't have to pay court costs because blah blah blah. The judge, in a rush, turned to me and asked, "You don't want to come back here just to make them bring a lawyer, do you?" I said I didn't, thinking he'd award me the $60. Instead, he said, "All right, let's just split the amount to save time, $30 in costs." Per my state's laws, the winning party gets full reimbursement of court fees, so I strongly disagreed with the judge splitting the amount due to being in a hurry. I contacted the Apple lawyer who had written to me after the first hearing to confirm the Genius Bar appointment, cited the relevant law, and pointed out that the judge had clearly made an error. I suggested Apple simply write me a check for the full $60, or I'd have to appeal, which would cost them an additional $125, making it $185 total. I was banking on their common sense, but they didn't have any. They responded that they'd only follow the court's ruling and would send a $30 check. I guess their arrogance wouldn't let them believe I'd actually appeal. So I filed an appeal. Since small claims court falls under the county court, the case moved to the higher county court. The county court is a serious proceeding, no joking around. I showed up and there was the same manager again. The judge, a lively guy clearly fueled by coffee, was friendly with everyone. I presented my case. The small claims court awarded me only part of the costs, despite state law entitling me to the full amount, since the ruling was in my favor. The judge turned to the manager. "Are you a lawyer?" The manager said no, but presented a letter from Apple's chief counsel, stating that Apple had no objection to his participation. The judge's face changed instantly. "Apple doesn't decide what you can do in my courtroom. You need a lawyer, so we'll likely have to reschedule." The judge turned to me. "Do you object to postponing the case so the defendant can find a lawyer?" I said, "Yes, Your Honor, because they've been told 3 times they need a lawyer, yet they keep disrespecting the court by sending the same unqualified person." The judge turned to the manager with a sarcastic smirk and a theatrical gesture saying, "Well, what can you do? Sorry." The ruling was in my favor, $185. As if that wasn't enough, 30 days later, Apple still hadn't paid me. I contacted their lawyer, who said they were considering options, as if they were planning to appeal to the state Supreme Court, which they had to do within those 30 days per state law. Once again, Apple thought they were too important to follow court orders or just act reasonably. But they forgot I used to work for them. I contacted my bank, asked them to pull up old payroll transactions to see which bank my salary came from, and got the answer. I filed another lawsuit, this time for debt collection through the bank. A few days later, of course, they sent the check. A colleague stole my Super Bowl tickets, but the arrogant partner claimed them for himself and got publicly humiliated for it. I'm a huge fan of the San Francisco 49ers. A few years ago, we made it to the Super Bowl. Back then, I was working at a consulting firm, directly managing several clients. One client knew how devoted I was to the 49ers. I was his main point of contact at the firm, and we got along well, even becoming friends. We'd regularly grab drinks or dinner after meetings. He had 2 extra corporate tickets to the game, and as a thank you for my work, decided to gift them to me. He passed the tickets to one of the partners, whom I'll call Thief, to give to me as a surprise. The game happened, we lost, and it sucked. The next time I met this client, we went for drinks, and he suddenly asked, "Hey, by the way, why didn't you go to the game? I heard someone else was in your seats." I was confused. "What game?" He said, "The Super Bowl." Completely thrown off, I replied, "I didn't have tickets to the Super Bowl." He explained that he gave Thief 2 corporate tickets to pass on to me as a gift. I had no idea what he was talking about. He looked shocked and told me to discreetly find out what happened and let him know. The next week, I learned from one of the secretaries that Thief had given my tickets as a gift to another client of his on behalf of our firm. Under different circumstances, I might have let it slide for the sake of peace, but these were seats at the 30-yard line for a game featuring my favorite team in the Super Bowl. I was floored. At first, I considered confronting Thief directly, but then I realized the client was the one who noticed I wasn't at the game, so I decided to let him handle it. I wrote to the client, "Just wanted to thank you for thinking of me and passing along the tickets. It seems they were given to another client of our firm." He immediately replied in all caps, "Are you kidding me?" Then added, "I didn't tell you anything. I'll handle it." Later, he got back to me, and we started discussing a plan. A couple of days later, we were invited to a meeting at the client's office. The client requested that Thief be there too. So the next week, we flew out for the business trip. Thief had no idea the client had planned a gloriously awkward spectacle to catch him red-handed. When we entered the conference room, all the usual faces were there, plus a woman in her 30s we didn't recognize. The client immediately introduced her. "Thief, this is Stephanie so-and-so, vice president from another department. She wanted to sit in on the meeting. Hey, author, you probably met her at the Super Bowl." Stephanie didn't extend her hand and said, "Oh, I don't think we met there. Sorry if I forgot." The client reacted, "My gosh, Steph, how much did you drink? Author was sitting right next to you." At this point, Thief was visibly nervous, trying to come up with something. He started, but Stephanie cut him off. "No, the guys from another company were there. By the way, I'm curious, why did we give corporate tickets to those guys? Do we have a joint project with them I don't know about?" Of course, there wasn't one. The companies were in completely different industries, like Coca-Cola partnering with John Deere, the farm equipment manufacturer. Thief mumbled, again, and the client cut him off. "Thief, I gave you those tickets to pass to author, right?" Now, Thief was beet red and replied, well, he couldn't go, so I guess I gave them to someone else. He turned to me with a look that screamed, cover for me. The client smirked. I said, what are you talking about? Client, did you give me Super Bowl tickets? The client raised his voice sharply. Thief, those tickets were a personal gift from me to author. You gave them to someone else? Pause. You regifted them to another client? Thief jumped in. Oh, maybe something got mixed up at the office. The client went silent, and for Thief, the pause probably felt like an eternity. Then he looked down, grabbed his briefcase and iPad, packed his bag, and said, looks like this meeting is over. Author, I owe you compensation. Let's go to lunch. Stephanie, you're invited too. To Thief, he said, Thief, I need to review our relationship. Please go home and wait for word from us. Thief tried to say he'd like to join us for lunch, probably to salvage the situation, but Stephanie shut him down firmly. I don't think that's a good idea, and asked reception to escort him to the elevator. As soon as the doors closed behind him, we all burst into hysterical laughter. Stephanie wasn't actually a vice president, just an employee the client brought in to play a role in this pre-planned scene. Still, she joined us for lunch, turned out to be a 49ers fan too, and was great company. On the way to the restaurant, I got a desperate message from Thief saying I needed to cover for the firm and we'd discuss everything when I got back. I replied, yeah, we need to talk, but I'll see what I can do. The client told me to wait a couple of hours and then send him the following. First, the client issued an invoice for the resale value of the Super Bowl tickets, which was far above face value, over $10,000, plus the cost of our lunch. He deliberately chose an expensive place and overpaid to make a point, demanding immediate payment. Second, he expected a personal apology to me. Third, he required a written apology to his company, as he considered this theft. Fourth, from now on, he would only deal with me or another partner at the firm, never with Thief again. This whole ordeal caused a stir among the other partners. I came out looking great, like I was sincerely trying to save the client for the firm despite being the victim of the situation. The client was reassigned to another partner, meaning Thief lost his share of the profits from that project. Oh, and the partners made Thief pay all the invoices out of his own salary. Looking back, I don't understand what he was thinking. Did he seriously believe the client wouldn't notice that I didn't thank him for the Super Bowl tickets? In any case, the atmosphere at the firm was poisoned for me after that since Thief wasn't going anywhere. I left a few months later for a much better position. The client cut ties with our firm a year later, and now works with my good friend at a competing company. I'm still pissed I missed the Super Bowl, even though we lost. I hope we make it to the finals again, and I'll finally go to the game in person. Before we move on to the third story, I suggest sharing your opinion in the comments about how doomed Thief's plan was from the start. The author here says, did Thief really think the client wouldn't notice? I think there was actually a chance it could have worked. If the author hadn't been so close with the client, maybe he wouldn't have noticed. I'd say there was a 30% chance it could have slipped by. Or maybe he'd noticed too late, like a year later. What do you think? Share your opinion.